Okay, I hope everyone can see the screen. This is James Tanner coming to you again from the BYU Library Family History Center in Provo, Utah. But these presentations are recorded, and we have our YouTube channel under the BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel, and we have them on our website. So you can find these videos and all of the previous videos. We now have a little over 1,000. Well, today we're going to talk about tracking your ancestors after a divorce. This is kind of an interesting topic, and the problem that we have, of course, is that it's kind of sad or unpleasant. And it's always sad or unpleasant in genealogy as you go through all of your relatives and your ancestors. The more time you spend, the more likely you are to run into situations that were not optimal. People who were not honest and were arrested and perhaps convicted, and others who are not having a happy lives. But it's all part of our history, and kind of urge everyone as they get into this to the history is to not, in other words, don't take it personally. Don't come and try to incorporate all of that, back and forth difficulties that you find into your life. They are the lives of those people who lived, and they were historic people. You are related to them, and you should be happy to learn about them. But perhaps there are lessons that can be learned from their unhappy situations as well as from their happy situations. Just some history, in case you wanted to know more about what the divorce laws were. The earliest known divorce was in ancient Mesopotamia, about 2000 BC, when women were given the right to separate from their husbands. All that was recorded on cuneiform tablets like the one we see in this image. So it's not something new. It's not an innovation. It's not something that's here locally in the United States. It's generally an issue that happens in every country throughout the world in every time, even back into antiquity and prehistory. So let's kind of get a timeline, however, because the official national attitudes towards divorce have changed dramatically over time. And first of all, it's important to understand this, that when you're doing research and genealogical research and one of the two spouses disappears, there's a number of possibilities. First of all, the person could have died, and that's not uncommon. The second one is they could have separated and we're no longer not longer together, but we're still living. And the third possibility is they separated and they actually got an official divorce from whatever organization, cultural or governmental organization that they lived under. And then the other part of that is, and there may be even another reason in addition to what I just said, and that is that the person is simply gone to some other place for some work purpose. And I'll kind of go through all those in a little more detail. But one of the things that is important to understand with records, and when you're starting to look and trying to understand what's happening with a particular individual, with a particular person or family, is the dates when any kind of divorce, regardless of the restrictions placed upon it by whatever government was creating that particular law, had a beginning. And this case, it was first applied in France in 1762. That means you go back before 1762, there were no divorces, period. End of the story. Germany divorce was first applied in 1875. You can see the dates kind of jump here, and you'll be more likely to be involved in finding some situation if it happened after 1875 rather than a separation or some other resolution before 1875. Italy, 1974. So we're, up another 100 years towards the present. And so only after 1974 is there any divorce possibilities in Italy. There were annulments, but there were no divorces. Spain, let's say, jumped even further and closer to the present. That is 1981. So you're not likely to find any divorce situations prior to 1981. And that gives you a kind of a starting place. Now, here in the United States, the first state, Maryland, which has always turned out to be one of the more, let's call it, open or liberal, it would be a wrong term to, it's not a political issue, it's a cultural liberalism. And that is, it's the first one to legalize divorce in 1701. So we're kind of jumping back to even before they were beginning to legalize divorces in Europe. And then we jump way forward because California was the first state in the US to legalize no-fault divorce in 1970. And as an attorney and who practiced in my life, I was an attorney for 39 years, sometimes more or less active in the practice of law. But basically, I was a trial attorney when people ask. And one of the early times before I got pretty well upset with it was taking divorce cases. And what was the catalyst in having me walk away from ever doing any more divorce law was spending an entire afternoon while a couple argued over who got the blender. Yeah, the thing that you turn on to make shakes and stuff like that. So that was the argument. At the end of it, I was about ready to say, hey, I'll go out and buy both of you a blender if you just get going here. But anyway, that was kind of the catalyst. And that was kind of the history of my legal career. I would simply start deciding that there were types of cases I didn't like until I was pretty much specializing in real estate and business operations and things like that. Okay, so no-fault divorce came along. It was a big kind of issue around the country, and now it's kind of sort of in the background that there's not even any problem. The issue here was that if people wanted a divorce, I mean, what were you going to do? You could try to talk them out of them, which was mandatory in almost every court that I dealt with. If my clients wanted to get a divorce, they first had to basically go to some arbitration and consultations. They had to sit down with a specialist who would kind of question why they were doing it and if they could reconcile. And that happened, and they were successful a fairly good percentage of the time. But it was kind of a recognition that we were interfering with a cultural issue in this court system. And so having no-fault divorces meant that we didn't have to listen to all of the bad things that everybody had done to each other, that we could simply say, okay, we don't want to listen to all that. And that really helped to, not did it, and of course the counter to that was that it kind of made it easier for people to get a divorce, and so marriages were threatened and all that sort of thing. So there's back and forth on all of this, but it's important to know that, because after that particular date, when the no-fault was legalized, that you're not going to find any kind of detailed records as to anything about the divorce. It's going to just have a standard form that was filled out by the parties. And the last state to legalize no-fault divorce, every other state legalized it, and it was in 2010, just not too far back in time. So these are the kinds of milestones. Now, why is this important to genealogy? That, once again, I'm going to emphasize this because I'll probably repeat it 2 or 3 times. And that is that we deal with records. We deal with historical records, and the historical records start with today's records and go back in time to antiquity. And we need to know when we begin looking for a type of record that may be important for us. as to when that record actually started being made. And a good example is parish registers in England, which began as a result of an edict from William VIII and in 1538. So that was the beginning date. Well, in the United States, every one of the types of records that we talk about had a beginning date, even if it was 1620 when some of the first settlers arrived, or even earlier than that in Virginia. But these dates are always helpful, because if you don't know that date when you start doing your research, you may have no research at all if what you find is that the events that you're looking at in your ancestors or relatives' lives fall older than that date. So anything earlier than these dates, you're just not going to find it, or you're going to find more records or fewer records or whatever after a certain date. So all these dates have an effect on almost every type of research you do. And it's interesting to know that the first modern no-fault divorce law was enacted in Russia in 1917. So it wasn't something that wasn't well defined long before the United States got around to doing it. And no-fault divorce was established in Australia, for example, in 1975. I just give you a couple of examples of countries so that you know that when you get into this situation, that after 1975 in Australia, you're not going to get a lot of information out of a divorce case, other than the names of the parties and perhaps the ruling of the court. And once again, another country, Canada, which was effectively permitted in 1986. So it's all different dates for different countries. So one of the things to know about, and let's say you're doing research in England, is the number of divorces that were being granted by the government in any given time period. And it was only until 1880 that the number of divorces in England increased significantly when they passed the Married Women's Property Acts of 1880 and 1882. Before 1880, the number of divorces in England was usually under 300 per year. So if somebody disappears out of a married couple, what I would call a marital community, would be not a divorce if it happened before 1880, because you only got 300 of them in the entire country from that before that time every year. So it rarely fell below 300, but after 1882, but by World War I, it was over 1,000 per year. So divorce is something that's relatively new in some countries, depending on the country and the way that divorces were allowed. And before the mid-19th century, the only way to get a full divorce was through a private act of parliament. And between 1700 and 1857, there were only 314 private acts of parliament, and they're almost all initiated by husbands. So it's just not done, and there was no way out of it. Now, that didn't mean people didn't go off and live with each other and live separate lives, but that was the reality of the way that we're looking when we're looking for any kind of documentation of that particular problem. And here's another one, kind of jumping down into Argentina, which comes home to me as I lived in Argentina for a couple of years, was prior to 1944, there was no absolute divorce. You could ask for a personal separation only, and it expressly prohibited dissolution of the marriage. So in Argentina, it was not uncommon to have two different families where one of the spouses the husband or the wife were married to the other family's husband or wife. So, in other words, they had split up, but then they had begun creating a family with someone else, and so they're living in this as two separate families, and even more with more splits. But basically, that was something that we found as I was a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Argentina. Now, as you go back into your family, you may have a tradition about a divorce in one of your ancestral families. Okay, so if you do have this situation, if you're questioning, for example, your aunt or grandmother, whatever story that says that so and so got a divorce and left the family and they were destitute and we had all these problems and on and on. And the answer is you still need to get back into the context of the history, and you need to do your research on the place where that was supposedly happening and the time frame of the people involved. Now, it's going to require just regular genealogical history research. You're just going to have to get in and do the research and look for the records. And we'll go through in a few minutes, I'll go through the records that we need to look at. But in the sense that what we're looking at in that situation where you have this story is you need to find out if people could really get a divorce at that time. In other words, it wasn't an abandonment and not a divorce, and it makes a difference. And we'll talk about that also in just a few minutes. So this is what's important to understand, that divorce is, in almost all cases that I've talked about so far in the different countries, is a legal action. It usually takes place in a court, and it affects property rights and ownership. So think about it. So if you're a genealogist and you're looking for information that would indicate there was some kind of a divorce, in this one statement, you just have a whole bunch of different types of records that you could look at. You could look at probate records. You could look at land and property records. You could look at tax records. You could look at any kinds of census records. Everything out there is one way. And it's not unusual to find a family where there's the parents and they have a number of children or maybe no children. But then you find the census record, and the next census record, the husband or the wife has disappeared. They're no longer in that census area. And so they didn't get counted as part of the census. So then you have the question that comes forth: what happened to that person? Where did they go? What do we have to do to find that person? Well, that's the whole purpose of this presentation, is to kind of explore how that's going to happen. Just be aware that many state courts in the United States have special divisions for divorce actions. And here's one this is a copy of a calendar of the different courts in Arizona. And you can see there's civil, criminal, and there's family. And they have divorce, decrees and hearings, court offered support, conciliation services, resolution conference, et cetera, and et cetera. The no-fault divorce title that goes with the divorce does not mean that there aren't property issues that have to be resolved and have to be mandated by the court. So you still have to get some court to sign off on that deal. And they have to make it effective. If the husband and the wife, marital partners, are divorcing each other, there's going to be a change of property. One of the parties is going to get the house or not get the house. One of the parties get the farm or not get the farm. And so those things are all things that need to be recorded because they affect property interests. And so it's not a private thing. Getting a divorce is not private at all. Divorces are, by definition, public issues. And the public issue is that the divorced couple or partners are going to have to make decisions about property. Now, if they're so poor that they don't have any property at all, that's a different problem. It's the same problems you have. Maybe they can't even afford to go and get a divorce. But on the other hand, which happens in many countries, by the way, not just talking about the United States. But on the other hand, if it is possible to get a divorce, then that's a way that the property between the two parties can be separated. Now, divorce obviously is kind of the opposite of a marriage. When the marriage happens, there's changes in property ownership automatically in any marriage. And even if one of the parties or the other part or both parties sign consent forms that say they don't have any disclaimer forms, they don't have any interest in their other partner's property, that's still a property issue. And it still has something because most of the courts presume property ownership. In fact, the way the laws happen in cases where property is involved in litigation is it's very frequent that the court there's an issue of whether the partners have an interest or don't have an interest. And so that is kind of the basis of what's going on here. And as I talk about that, I hope you begin to understand that everything that I've said creates records. And those records may or may not be easily obtainable, but they are probably there someplace. And so that may clarify everything that goes on in all of these situations, is that if you can, and in some cases, get access to the records. Now, if your divorces happened, like say, since the no-fault divorce in the present, it's not an issue of not having the records. The main issue is going to be access to those records because of privacy issues and all sorts of other things. And the court may or may not have made that open, but this is going to be the heart of what you're going to be looking for. But in other cases, you may have an injunction, you may have guardianship problems, you may have all sorts of different things, that you may even have adoption issues. There's just a lot of things that come out on this. Now, the parties don't have to go to court for a no-fault divorce in Arizona if they agree to the terms of the divorce, but the action's still in the court system. It's still a court action. It's still a public court action. So that's the kind of the key here to understanding. Court divorce records are generally public. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. They're public, with only exceptions for sensitive information. Maybe, and the kinds of information what we're talking about in sensitive is minor, the children. In other words, there may be sensitive information about the children because of differences between the parties. There may be issues with certain types of property. And it's just all of this is part of what you have to go through in the kind of messy situation when you get into the divorce, even when you're in court. So where would you start? How do you know there might have been a divorce? Well, obviously, if there's a divorce and you find it in the court records, then there was a divorce. So if somebody disappears, one of the parties to a party disappears, you might automatically think the person died, go look for a death certificate. That'd probably be a good idea. Go look for a death record if it's too far back in time. And your first research evidence of a divorce might come through a census, through land and property, through newspapers, sometimes in wills and probate records. In some periods of time, during some periods of time, before no fault, but in some periods of time, the issue of the divorce, the fact of a divorce was published in newspapers. So was notifications to creditors and to people who had where they had debts. So both ways, that there was something going on here that was going to affect the property's ownership and the rights. And I have to say this, but failure to name a spouse may also indicate the person died, and you may have to go look for that and rule that out. Now, what if they just disappear off the face of the earth? Well, that still happens fairly frequently. And that is one of the challenges of doing research in genealogy. So let's look at kind of what it looks like in the records. These are taken from the Family Search family tree. And here we see that Calvin Morgan is married to Crystal Jacobson, and their marriage was in 1944. Okay, so then we look at the further records, and we find that they are no longer, they're being counted out as being separate in those records. And I just have to say this because we don't have time in this kind of a format here with this 1 hour class to go into the explanations of all the details of how you would go through this. But bear in mind that there's going to be some indication that there was a divorce. But in this case, the death dates aren't inclusive because Crystal lived for at least 12 years after Calvin. Calvin died in 1980. Crystal lived until 1992. And so what would happen? If there was a remarriage and it was after Calvin died, then there obviously wasn't a divorce, and there obviously had nothing to do with the legal action. So you need to go research each of the family members. Of course, the remarriage would indicate a divorce. So here we have Melvin King Samuelson married to Crystal Jacobson, and the marriage took place in 1956 in Clark County, Nevada. Now, Clark County is already an interesting place for the venue for this marriage for a lot of reasons. It was notorious for the fact that you could go to Clark County and get a quick divorce, but you could also get a quick marriage. So they could have gone there and gotten divorce and marriage at the same time. They had no children, and he died in 1984 and she died in 1992. So she wasn't married to him long after who knows when the separation, but if she got married in 1956, they lived a long time. Their marriage lasted a long time. And so they were married quite a while. And moving on, and this is one thing that's obvious, and if we go back and look at the dates, and I'm just telling you that the remarriage took place before the previous husband died. So the basic assumption there is there had to be a divorce. Now, here's the difficulty, that all this marriage and stuff, and maybe even the divorce, took place in Nevada, and that probably, because it was Clark County, probably was not where these two people were living it. They traveled to go there specifically for the marriage or for the divorce plus marriage. So this is kind of the situation that you have to do more research and get into more details, and particularly information that may appear in newspapers or other kinds of records that start to explain things. So here's another situation. Here's another one that occurred. Here, if we look at the dates and the times and when the people were when the people were born and died, and when the marriages took place, then we can begin to understand what was happening. And here we're focusing on Mary Ann Bryant. Mary Ann was born in 1826, died in 1905, and she married in New South Wales, in Maitland, New South Wales, in Australia, in 1844. Okay, so she was alive, and of course, both of them were alive at that time. Her husband, John Porter, died in 1892, but more research shows that Mary Ann Bryant married in California in 1854. That would have been only 10 years after the first marriage to John Porter. So the question here is, what happened here? There were actually 4 children from the first marriage. So what happened to the children? When was there a divorce, or was there not a divorce? And here's the issue. The issue is that it's Australia. And if you go what I just read earlier in this presentation about the dates in Australia, you'll see that getting a divorce in Australia was not possible. Was it possible in California, even if the husband was still in Australia? Those are some of the questions you might have to resolve. What happened to the children? Did they stay in Australia or did they come with Marianne to California? So all those questions are the kinds of things that rise when you see just this kind of on its face information about dates and places and marriages. And the issue here is something that happened and not too infrequently, especially in the times during the colonization of the United States when people were coming from countries in the 1800s to the United States frequently. They would get here as an individual like Marianne Bryant, and when they got here, they would get married, even though they were remainingly married to their previous spouse in some other country. Okay, so that's kind of the issue that we've got going here, is that even though there may not be obvious, but if you look at the dates and the places and the times and when the people were alive and when they died, then you can begin to say, well, we suspect there was a divorce, but there wasn't a legal possibility, and so they must have just gotten married anyway, which is what happens. So we're looking at these particular things. We're looking at the dates, the date of the marriage. We're looking at this marriage date. And when we get together with all of that, we are then in this position to decide, well, okay, fine. We can't find a divorce. We really don't care if there's a divorce because the reality of it is that she did move to America and she had another family. And then we can find out what happened to the children. So there's a lot more to this story, but was there a formal divorce? The answer is it's probably irrelevant to the story because if she left Australia, there was no property rights left in Australia. And there's nothing that they had to do. And Porter, we can see if Porter got married again also in Australia. So just because of a wife or husband leaves the home, also, this doesn't indicate there was a formal divorce. But it is a reason to search and see if there are divorce records for the times involved. And I'm picking these ones in Australia because they show a marriage in Australia, and then they show a subsequent marriage in the United States, in usually California, coming from Australia. So here we have someone named Edward Rodwell who's married to Sarah Parkinson. Okay. If you want some backstory here, and it's research that we did on this particular couple, these are some of my ancestors. And if you look back, Edward Rodwell was a criminal. He was arrested in London for burglary. He went through the whole legal system, was put on a boat, shipped to Australia as a criminal, on a transported criminal, went through the criminal period in Australia, got through with the criminal period, married Sarah Parkinson, which in Australian law pardoned him and gave him a pardon so that he could be legally married and legally own property from that point on. And then they had a couple of children, and then actually more. But something else happened. Well, what happened is that Edward Rodwell deserted Sarah and ran off with her sister and went back to England because then he could go back to England. So that was the end of that. Sarah then left Australia, came to America, and got to marry to Charles Stapley. So this all happened in 4 years after the issue with leaving Australia. So was there a divorce? The answer is no, there wasn't. Did anybody die? No, nobody died. It's just this is the way it happened. So one of the points that I wanted to make with this particular presentation is that as you get into this, if you have the perspective of looking at the history of divorce or the burial history or the adoption history or enslaved person history or indentured servant history, if you get into all those historical areas, you're going to find that a lot of the times it's futile to go ahead and look for records. And I have people come to me and ask questions like, I need a death record for my great great grandfather who died in Tennessee in 1852. And I go, well, do they have death records in 1852 in Tennessee? So we look that up and likely not. And so there's got to go somewhere else for besides his death certificate for a record. And this is what is indication with divorce records, because as you saw, there were different dates for when the divorces were even allowable. And so if they weren't allowed, then the people who were in those terrible situations would make decisions and do things which had nothing to do with the legality or whatever of what they were doing. So here's a long one. It's before the Matrimonial Cause Act of 1857. It was impossible to get a divorce. And it could only be attained by an act of parliament. And it was very expensive, only accessible to the wealthy. And so there's only a limited number of people that got divorces. So if you look at the time frame here and you look at what was happening to the Bryant Stapley Porter situation, then you realize that they just didn't have an option. There wasn't any way that they could do this, and they weren't going to live with the abusive or incompatible or whatever you want to call it partner. So there was a lot of legislation and problems going on, and there were people who were questioning the government's rights. So this is a long quote, but the problem, I'm not going to read this whole quote. It's simply a matter of going through and looking at this information. Important to understand that before the 20th century, divorces were uncommon and in some places illegal. So when you're going back and wondering about a divorce, all you have to do is look at England's records with their kings and realize that they actually had to do some major problems in the 1300s to even begin the process of having the king get a divorce. So you want to get into that sort of thing. And these are just some statistics to give you an idea of what we're talking about, because here in the United States, you're going to find this to be a lot more prevalent. And you're also going to find that it's not necessarily any easier to put together, but the records are going to be available. So right now, of all Americans 18 years or older, whether they've been married or not, 25 of them have gone through a marital split. That means that 25%. That means that somewhere along the line, they've gotten married and divorced. And 15% of adult women in the United States are divorced or separated today. And that's compared to less than 1% in 1920. So yes, no-fault divorce did create a lot more divorces. But the question isn't, did it create more divorces? The question is, did it have any effect on the separation of the parties? So that's another issue. Genealogically speaking, what happens to individuals after a divorce? What are we looking for after that? Well, the answer here is pretty straightforward. You have issues of child custody. So if children are involved, the primary caregiver may choose to relocate to a different area to be closer to schools, family, or other support systems. So whoever gets the children the majority of it, or with visitation or whatever, then they will be saying, oh, I'm going to go home. So they live in Ohio and they go home because their family all came from Arizona. And so they're going to go live in Arizona with their family. And that's very common. But then with the children, the problem is that you're going to find out them bouncing back and forth between Arizona and Ohio if that is what has been decided. So some of you, if you're familiar with the people around you, you probably have already had to deal with that kind of a situation, either personally or through friends or through acquaintances. You know people who are sharing custody of their children and their children are moving back and forth. From a genealogical standpoint, this makes it very difficult in the future. So if this was happening in the past, it would make it more difficult to find the children as well as identify the parents and where the parents lived and where they were living. So from the Ohio standpoint, this situation would simply show that all of the wife and all the children disappearing, and then it would show the children coming back to Ohio after a while, but they wouldn't necessarily know where the wife was or where the children were going in the interim. So that's kind of the situation. You might have to do a lot of research to get that figured out. And often job opportunities. So once a person gets a divorce, they may decide to get it or may have a job that says, and maybe the basis for the divorce was the job, that they had a job that was going to move them out of the country or to a different part of the country. And that was the end of the marriage because the spouse did not want to move or had their own job or had their own connections. So that's one of the issues. And if this is the case, then it's going to be tricky to come up with the records because they're not moving to an area where they're going to be permanent. They may be moving around and not be, maybe more difficult to find. And they may feel it and they may wanted to move and one of them didn't want to move and the husband or the wife leaves because they don't want to leave the community and somebody would get a fresh start in some other location. And maybe the cost of living in the areas will affect whether or not they move. Now, from a genealogical standpoint, you may not be looking at all these records, but you need to be aware of all of these kinds of forces that are in play and why and where someone would move. So doing your research, you need to find out if the spouse shows up in another state with another family, with her family or his family. And so that's sort of the issue that's being addressed in this kind of discussion. But in essence, finding the individuals after the divorce is no different than finding anyone who leaves for school or for work or other reasons. If there's a divorce, however, there are more records that need to be searched. So if there's no divorce, obviously there's no records if the person, the people around me currently are in the situation where in most cases one of the spouses or the other spouse is constantly traveling. We have where one of the spouses is a flight attendant, and we have situations where a spouse is hired by an oil company and has to move halfway around the world and will be there for a year, and others where spouses commute back and forth across the country for a job. These are kinds of things that still will be important in making determinations after a divorce situation. And it may or may not be an indication of a divorce. So you need to keep searching to see if there is a divorce or some other situation that created what happened. So then the question is, where are the divorce records? And my comment is divorce records are often filed with marriage records or not. So the answer is they could be in a specialized court. They could be in a different connections. They may be cataloged by one of the large online databases like Family Search and Ancestry and Find My Past, My Heritage, or whatever. But on the other hand, they may not be. They may be lumped in with marriage records or something else, other kinds of records. And one of the things that I mentioned briefly is that they may be in a court that's called like something like in the East, there's what are called orphans courts. And the orphans courts are when somebody dies and the children have to, there are minor children. But subsequently to creating that kind of a court where the minor children need a guardianship, even if they have a surviving spouse, then basically in that situation, they decided to put all of the probate records and some of the divorce records and everything else in that same court. So it just depends on the jurisdictions and each court, and each state is going to divide up the caseload depending on what resources they have and what the court system allows. Important thing though is that divorce court proceedings could have additional information. So if you know there was a divorce and you find the record for the divorce, it's very likely that you may have a list of all the children, you may have a list of other people, siblings, parents, all sorts of things might end up in the divorce proceeding and mentioned as parties. And one thing you could say, if you wanted to be kind of give a generalization, is that multiple marriages probably indicate divorces. So if this individual, Ross, got married in 1932 and then again in 1944 and then again in 1964, you would think that there would be some divorce proceedings in here. Well, the problem was that yes, there might be ultimately divorce proceedings. And in Arizona, where this occurred primarily, this is Arizona, if this person had gotten married more than once to another person, in other words, multiple marriage situation, then it would be a chargeable action in Arizona, criminal action. So that was kind of not going to happen. But the question was whether the people were even married and when they married. So there's a lot of background here, and I don't think anyone would be able to go in and do the research. But you might be surprised that a lot of this might be in the newspapers and just stories in the newspaper. So here's the rule, depending on the time period involved, and that depends on the laws that were in effect in the country where the time thing goes on. When a person disappears from records, leaving the spouse, usually with children, you need to do additional research to determine death, divorce, or abandonment, or any of the other reasons that I mentioned about working away, going back and forth or whatever that looks like they're no longer available in the family. So there are the exceptions, in the abandonment. It might be church service. It might be a military service. I mean, they might be going as a missionary to Africa or wherever. They might have a military service. They might be a foreign location. They might have work and go someplace for work for a year, or an army and be stationed away in a different location. That was one of the considerations when I was in the Army, is you had accompanied and unaccompanied assignments. In other words, you have assignments where you were sent as an individual. Me would have been sent as an individual and not had my family with me, or I could have my family with me. And all I could tell you is that there was negotiations going on. It was easier to get an unaccompanied appointment than it was to get a assignment, than it was to get a a company assignment. Obvious reasons, it was cheaper for the Army. So here's kind of the general rule about everything. And it's not just missing spouses, but it's everything that you have any kind of difficulty with. You really need to do extensive research on all the members of the family, both before and after the separation date. You need to know what this family is to the extent that there are records, to the extent that you can do research, and get away from just doing vital records, for instance, what we call birth, marriage, and death records and the census, like are almost the only ones people look at. There's abundance of other kinds of records that we need to look at. And this is a situation to actually resolve any issues or any questions about what was happening with the divorce, is when we are in the position of really getting into doing basic research. So this extensive research might have to be done to ferret out the details of what was going on, and using contemporary sources that would give us some insight into the family. That might be letters, it might be other kinds of documents, and as I've mentioned a number of times, news articles and newspapers. And then there's another problem, and that is the names. In the United States, women who get a divorce will have an opportunity to change their name. And this one is one from another Arizona one, where from Greer King, her maiden name was DeWitt. She got married to an Army officer, King, who was killed in action in the Army. She remarried to Mason, but never took Mason's name. Well, she took Mason's name for convenience sake, but when she divorced Mason, she came back and took her not her maiden name, but her married name. And so when you're starting to look for people and you can't seem to find anything, there's some more other kinds of research that need to be done, and more detailed research into the family. So this is where you need to get into the real deep research. So keep searching and don't believe everything you read or hear. Thanks for watching.